Dr. Glenn. Can everyone hear me okay? All right, well, I'm really excited to be here. Thanks for hiring me. And I think actually some of you might be in one of my DPA classes next semester. I'm given to understand I'll be teaching quant methods. So that'll be a lot of fun, and I don't know what other class I'm teaching right now, and I'll probably be on a few of your dissertation committees as well. This is just my email for right now, but hopefully I'll be getting a UIS email soon, and I like to move around too, so I'll probably be going back and forth between this. But first of all, does everyone have a copy of the files that Dr. Bland sent out, of the 3 sample literature reviews? Okay, anyone who doesn't have one? Okay, that's okay, we can share. Okay, so let me just tell you what we're gonna be doing today. As Dr. Bland mentioned, I used to work as a writing consultant, and this was essentially helping government and nonprofit employees craft numerous types of documents, both academic, professional documents, and so forth. And so in that experience, I began to value being able to talk about writing in a very nuts and bolts sort of way. Because sometimes it can be, very high level, saying, well, this is what should accomplish. And I found that for a lot of really busy practitioners in particular, they want to know, how exactly do I do this? Do you have a template you can follow? So this is going to be very, very hands in the Play-Doh sort of presentation right here. And what we're going to be doing is we're going to be talking a little bit about understanding the basics. There's a couple of key ideas I really want you to get around about literature reviews. We're going to be doing some samples. I believe in reviewing samples first, and then we're going to reverse engineer them to see how you might be able to work with them. Also, particular ways of taking notes. I think a key aspect of writing a literature review is knowing how to take notes. I don't know if it's the correct way, but at least the way that I do it, which might as well be the correct way, but bad joke. Okay, no one laughed. Also, a little bit about organizing notes, shaping sections using MEAL. It's a heuristic that's used in teaching professional writing. It stands for Main Point Evidence Analysis and Linking. And it's actually the heuristic around which all literature reviews are written. Whether people refer to it that or not, that's actually what it is. Going over what I call Mad Libs. One of the ways in which I teach writing is that I say, insert, here's the beginning of a sentence, insert blank here, something like this. And this will show you a lot about the structure. And then we're going to have a little bit of a note on APA. So, I'm going to begin by just pointing to someone in the audience. And Jamie, since you're right here, I'm going to pick on you. So, let me ask and have you answer these 2 questions. But first, the first question. In just 1 to 3 words, how was your day yesterday?
Super tiresome.
Super tiresome, okay. Everyone remember that? I wish I had a board to write up here, but why?
I had just flown back from Mexico City, and then I had to go to class last night.
Okay, what class was it?
Public management seminar.
Okay, fantastic, fantastic. So believe it or not, if you can answer these 2 sort of questions, you can conduct a literature review. Because very often it ends up being skills that are that simple. Why? Why answering a question, how was your day, and why? How might these be related to writing a literature review? And anyone just feel free to speak up. And if you don't know, then we're going to spend an hour talking about why.
They're open-ended questions, how and why.
Okay, yeah. But how? What about, what are the skills in there that might be implicated with the literature review? Yeah?
You have to recall details.
Okay, good. And the details are supporting something that's actually a little bit more important than the details itself, which is what? Which, yeah?
The summary.
Yeah, exactly, exactly. Because in the end, with Jamie, what we want to know, it was super tiresome. And she had many reasons as to why it was super tiresome. Believe it or not, that is the essence of what a literature review is. Taking individual pieces of information and inductively creating some sort of master summary of it. For the same reason that if we look at statistical studies and we have 10,000 observations, do we really want to know, well, person 1 said this, person 2 said this, person 999 said this? That would make for the most boring article of all time and would, kill a bunch of trees. We need to do certain tests in order to find the big overall picture. And that's essentially a skill that I think is important with the literature review. Because answering how your day was is all about looking over many pieces of evidence and coming to a central conclusion. And I think these 3 things are things we need to keep in mind. I'll be referring to these all throughout the presentation, so when you know that I use these words, this is how I'm using them. Categories. These are just topics and subtopics in the literature. And we have a lot. In social equity accountability, there's the topics of racism, for instance. That is a subtopic in it. Or there's performance measurement. That's another subtopic. Anything that you talk about in your dissertations or anything else, it's always divided up into topics and subtopics. But that's not the big thing. The big thing is that we need to look at themes, because it's one thing to know what is in the literature. It's a different thing to say, here's what it means. Here is what it says overall. So a theme is what the literature says overall for a category of literature. So look at it this way. I'm on a lot of MPA capstones. A lot of them work for nonprofits, or they have nonprofit clients. And a lot of them have projects on volunteer retention. So that is a category in the literature. What a theme for that literature would be here is what the literature indicates about why people volunteer. Here is what the literature indicates about why people stop volunteering. Here's what the literature indicates about what you need to do to improve programs. And you need them in declarative statements. The literature indicates people tend to volunteer for X, Y, and Z reasons, which you just go through X, Y, and Z. But also in terms of snapshots, because a literature review is much like this picture of Paris, which I wish I had taken. I was actually on Tour Montparnasse. That's Montparnasse Tower, and my picture didn't come out that great. But this is really what a literature review is about. Standing on top of Tour Montparnasse, looking over Paris and saying, this is a reasonable representation of what Paris looks like at this time. And of course, it's limited because you don't see anything on this side. And I know I used to live in Paris, and don't worry, there's nothing really worth seeing on that side, but that's my personal opinion. But you see a few things, La Tour Eiffel, La Défense, Les Invalides, and so forth. You get a very good idea of what the things are that are there. A literature review is the same sort of principle. So let's take this example, and then we're going to be getting into more nuts and bolts. So how many rectangles are there, and what color are they? Of course, I actually have a mild color blindness, so my answer of what color they are might differ from others, but seriously. 5, okay, what color are they? Okay, fantastic. Taken in terms of a literature review, imagine that these were individual studies on a particular topic. So we would say something like, the literature is unanimous in stating that, blue, whatever it happens to be. The literature is unanimous in stating that, whatever this happens to be about public affairs. Now imagine you had something a little different. I know this is very basic right now, but we're building up. Imagine it's something like this. So just amuse me. It'll be in my class, there'll be a lot of amusing me. Just kidding. What is it? Okay, good. Why am I using this to talk about a literature review? Because people always say, well, the literature review literature doesn't seem to have agreement on certain topics. What if it seems to say this and it seems to say that? So what we can ultimately conclude about this is the literature largely notes blue, but some studies indicate this other thing. This is all about getting to these themes based upon these categories. And yet another example, well, this is sort of fun because I heard a conversation about this earlier about different theoretical perspectives and what we can test and not test. Easy. The literature identifies at least 2 contrasting explanations of X. One indicates blank, the second indicates blank. And then just a little bit more complex. If you had multiple blocks, which of course what your literature reviews are going to be for your dissertations, you would just say at least 3 major categories are evident in the literature. Literature on X suggests this, literature on Y indicates this, and literature on Z notes blank. You just need to be a little bit more creative with the sentence structure. So before we go into our samples, why am I talking to you about blocks and colors and so forth?
Then you can apply those into criminal justice or healthcare or whatever topic you have.
Yes, because I think the most central thing about the literature review, it's not just what the individual studies are. I would argue that actually the more important thing, instead of the individual studies, is what do they say as a whole. And in my years of teaching writing, and I've been teaching writing for, 15 or so years, that's very often the thing that people struggle with the most. They struggle with, well, what does the literature say overall? How do I move beyond the author by author by author sort of thing? And how do I develop propositions and hypotheses that I can then test based upon that. And this is essentially what we're going to be doing today, but it all comes back to this. Because in the end, this is a saying that we used to have in teaching of writing, and I'm just going to share some of the trade secrets with you, is we always used to joke that any person who is reading any document, including ones we write ourselves, might have the attention span of a fruit fly. This is a little joke that editors just say among one another. What they mean by that is that people need to know what the absolute most important thing is. It needs to be readily identifiable, no confusing it, and so forth. Because people, when they read, they tend to say, well, what am I supposed to get here? And they will probably glaze over some of the details. The details are, of course, important, but ultimately what people need to know is that structure of, okay, 3 blue, 1 yellow, so forth and so on. What do I need to take away from this? Tell me in a sentence how your day was, and so forth. That's essentially what the literature review is. So with that in mind, let's actually take a look at some samples so we can talk about this a little bit more. So what I'd like you to do is to get your samples ready for the well-being of immigrant Latino youth, as well as the political power and policy design article. Okay. So just to give you a little bit of background on this, I first discovered this first article, The Well-Being of Immigrant Latino Youth, actually in a book about how to teach or how to write literature reviews, and it was actually listed as a model literature review and so forth. And so what we're going to do, we're actually going to take it apart to see how it's constructed, because I think one of the most difficult aspects of writing a literature review is really about how to put it together and so forth. I mean, we're all right with reading and so forth, but we need to put it into this framework. So what I'm going to, this is actually in the original document. So what I'm going to ask you to do, read just the introduction and pretend there's nothing else past the introduction. So just read those 3 paragraphs to yourself really quickly, and we'll talk about them. Everyone has their own copies, right? Because I know some people looking up here. I think it might be a little small to look at it that way. Okay. Probably have a good sense. If you're still reading it, just go ahead and skim over the rest. So this is actually a really solid introduction to a literature review. And I think, depending upon your committee, your literature reviews would benefit from something similar. Or if you go to write articles, it would benefit from something similar. Maybe shorter than that, of course, but it's still essentially that. So what is the basic structure of the introduction to this literature review? What's the basic, just those 3 paragraphs? What's the basic structure? What's it doing in the order that it's doing it?
Stating the problem, about the research that exists, and then say the
Okay, perfect. I mean, I couldn't have said it better myself. So that's exactly right. And your literature reviews would benefit from something similar. This first paragraph is very intentionally constructed. All that it's doing is going from a general statement of importance to a clear problem definition. And of course, the general statement of importance, first sentence and the first 2 sentences. According to the 2000 census, Latino population in the United States has increased by this amount over 10 years, growing from this to this. So just nice contextual information. But it doesn't just stop there. It contextualizes it immediately by narrowing the scope to a particular issue. Because eventually where it goes through, of course, is saying there's been changes in where there's some locations, As a result, health and human service providers in both traditional and new receiving communities are working with increasing numbers of Latino clients. Then it gets really to the kicker. To better serve these clients, helping professionals will need to understand X. And this is in particular because of this. Service providers will need to understand the risk and protective factors associated with migration and acculturation. It gets to the point incredibly quickly. And all literature reviews, believe it or not, do this same, well, these are the good ones, do this same basic thing of going from a statement of general importance down to a problem definition. The second paragraph, what does it do? It's probably the most important one. Okay, and what else? It is the categories. So I don't want to go to the next slide because the next slide has what it is. I'll just go back. So okay, so it overtly identifies the categories and the themes. So that way, if you are so inclined, you could almost read nothing beyond this paragraph. Of course you should, but nothing beyond this paragraph, and you would still get the gist of what they're saying. This is one of the most critically important elements of a literature review in any type of research. That's the snapshot right there. It says what the categories are, and it says what the literature says overall. It's the inductively derived statement of here is what it says overall. And just listen to the language. We'll be going over this in a lot more detail later. Research suggests that Latino youth face multiple threats to their well-being, including substance use, poor physical functioning, and early adult role-taking. How'd they get that statement? Well, of course, they read a bunch of things about these topics and said, here's what it says overall. And they do this 2 other times. These risks may be particularly acute, and despite these risks, additional research suggests so forth. These are the most important things about this literature review, like I said before. And this last one is just the nice blueprint statement, some indication of the purpose of the literature review, and any information necessary to understand context. You could probably do this in a sentence, quite frankly. The following review reviews literature on status of Latino youth, so forth, and so on. Okay. Now what I'd like you to do is, if you have the printed copy, flip the page, and then, this is slightly different, and take a glance at this whole section all the way to the final paragraph, which I think starts with taken together, I want to say. Okay, and if wherever you are, just go ahead and skip to that last paragraph that begins with taken together. I think I have this thing memorized by now, this sample. Okay. So what we're going to be doing is we're going to be talking a little bit about this section, and then we're going to be talking exactly how these authors can get there and how you can do the same thing for your dissertations. How is this section basically structured? How is it basically structured?
He structures it into groups focused on the status of the youth, the risk factors,
Sure.
protective factors, and within each of these categories, then
Okay. So in other,
Specific topics.
so in other words, it's a narration of these things in the order that they appear, right? Which is another thing to keep in mind. This is overtly establishes not only the structure, but what this is about. Each few sentences in the paragraphs are what? In every single one of these paragraphs that's on that second page, the first one or two sentences does what? I can't hear you.
Tell you the message they want to say.
Which is what?
Topic sentence.
Which is what? For a literature review.
The meat is your acronym of meat.
It was meal, but meat works too. Okay. Okay. Well, what's the M? It's the main point, and the main point of any paragraph or any section of the literature review is what? It is what the literature says overall about a given topic. That's what people ultimately want to see. And that's how you avoid the author by author by author element, is because you're combining it into a framework of meaning of saying, here is what the literature says overall. So it has clear main points that indicate what the literature says overall. It indicates the quality and state of the literature. First two sentences in here, few investigations of this exist. But of those few, most focus on this other element right here. It tells you what it's saying, and it gives you the state and quality of the literature. Because you're very often going to be in a situation where there might just be a handful of studies on your particular topic, and you have to be honest about it and communicate that to your audience, and then give a narration of a representative sample. But that overall framework has to be there. And of course, as we have right here, it ends with a little bit of analysis. This last paragraph is critically important for a literature review, because this is very often, if you have propositions and hypotheses, and we'll be talking about them a little later, this is where you begin to indicate here is where they are. This is so important. Taken together, the literature suggests that regardless of the presence of these strengths, Latino youth are suffering. Okay. Just in case you hadn't read anything prior to that point, you could go to that one sentence and say, okay, I don't know if I get it, but at least I have, here's what the overall snapshot is. And the rest of this information does a few particular things. First of all, it indicates what's missing. Well, the context of the struggle's missing. Why do we care that the context of the struggle's missing? Why do we?
The gap that you identified that you're going to address.
Okay, and it also specifically takes into account not only what this gap is, it says here's what's missing, here's exactly what's missing, and here's the consequences of what happens with this being missing. They are poorly informed about which youth are having difficulties and so forth. And then, of course, the potential risk is inadequately informed theoretical and intervention models. So here's what the lesson of this looking at these samples are before we get into nuts and bolts. Here's why we started looking at these samples first. Because every single literature review you read, whether it's a dissertation, whether it's a journal article, what have you, is still going to be structured around these basic principles. Main points, bunch of studies, here's what they say overall, here's what's missing, boom, go on to the next section, and then 20 pages later, you're done. That is essentially one of the deep, dark secrets of writing a literature review. And then if you have this structure in your mind, it forces you to think in terms of main points and main points and evidence, and with an analytical summary and transition to the next element. And again, in my 15 years of teaching writing, I have found that that's the thing that people, whether they say it or not, most people end up really struggling with, is that I don't know how to put this together, and so forth, into this framework. And so here's what we're going to be doing from here on out, is looking how you actually get from a single study all the way to this framework that, of course, will be part of your dissertation. So any questions thus far? All wonderfully straightforward. All right, I like it. But if you look at also the policy alternatives article, which I had you read, you're going to be noticing that it essentially does the same thing as well. Notice, of course, they do the same thing. Starts with the main points, and that it's very, very obvious here. It's time-consuming to analyze a large number of policy options. However, as research demonstrates, some explanation. Then the same thing, main points right here. And notice how obviously worded everything is. To just one at early stage is problematic for at least 3 reasons. And of course, the use of these ordinal words to indicate what these points are. Again, main points, being very obvious about the sub-main points. Here's a study that illustrates it, and then you just do that again and again and again and again. Isn't that fun? I think it's fun. And also notice that their analysis, I think this is on page 94 or 95 of the article. They take a little bit of a break somewhere in the article, and they're saying, just in case you missed everything, which, sometimes I admit I skim all the time when I read these articles. It says, in sum, here's what you need to take away from this. And then it also begins to introduce this particular question. In this article, the first question is, how often is more than one policy option analyzed and presented, and so forth. So you know that a literature review is MEAL. Main point, evidence, analysis, linking, transition. Let's go into the next topic again and again and again. And you could just read other elements right there to see that that's essentially what they're doing again and again. So, how do we get to these points? How do we ultimately get into crafting that literature review? We ultimately have to start with knowing a little bit about the essence of how these literature reviews are supposed to be structured. So you have your introduction, which is written last. And the introduction, of course, should be essentially like the Latino youth article. 3 major elements, which are what? There you go, fantastic, fantastic memory. Yep. I love it. Briefly link the literature review to an overall issue, identify categories of literature and so forth, and the body, which is written first, which is actually written one piece at a time, and then brought together into a coordinated whole. It's organized into one subsection for each category of literature, and each category has a theme. And then it's organized using MEAL. We're going to be going into how to create MEAL. Main point, evidence, analysis, and linking. And of course, strong topic sentences that fully capture the intent of a paragraph. Because how many times have you been with someone and you just say to them, will you please get to the point? Some of you might be saying that about me right now, as a matter of fact. But this is essentially what we're ultimately trying to go for. And then the conclusion, which is written second to last. And this is the way, incidentally, I wrote the literature review for my dissertation and all of my published articles as well. It reminds readers of the theme, i.e. what the literature says overall for each category of literature. We'll be talking a little bit about how you introduce propositions and hypotheses, depending on whether you're doing qualitative or quantitative research. But this is essentially what you're going through. 3 major elements. Literature reviews love 3 for some reason. I don't know why, but they do. And of course, I can also share these slides so you're not rapidly writing them down as I cycle through them. So you're using this MEAL system. The key point is to start with evidence. I began by saying this is an inductive process. And inductive reasoning is what?
Specifically on
Yeah, or specific to general, right? Exactly. And deductive is basically, yeah, there you go. It's just the flip of that. So it really is, in many ways, an inductive process first, and then a deductive process as you go on. Inductive meaning you read a bunch of studies, here's what they say overall, and deductive to identify, I need to try to find this particular element of the literature. So what I'm going to be talking to you about, nuts and bolts, again, because I used to teach this for 15 years to practitioners a lot. I'm going to teach you something that I like to call the paraphrase or summarize as you go method. It's the only way that I use to write literature reviews. I wouldn't want to write it any other way. It's saved my bacon a couple times, and which is basically creating notes in a very particular way with citations, grouping notes into categories, shaping those categories one at a time using MEAL, putting a conclusion and an introduction on there, and so forth. And this is what we're going to be going through. And I'm going to be showing you an actual example from my writing to show that I actually really do this. So first of all, I think it's important to say that to have a good literature review or to have a beginning of a solid literature review, notes have to be taken in a very particular way. It's very important to have notes about a single article taken in a very particular way. Now, I don't know about you, but I don't like having a stack of papers off the ground of articles I want to read, or even a stack of articles on my computer that I ultimately have to read. I'm the sort of person who, I want to read an article, get what I want from it, turn it into digestible form, and then never have to look at it again. But, you know, I'm a minimalist in certain ways, but, you know, that's at least what I try to go for. And so what it means is that I learned this little trick, and it turns out that I didn't create this. It's actually been in the writing literature for quite a while, about a particular way to take notes depending upon what you're reading. And it begins with an empirical article, which is the essence of what we're really going about. Author year studied A using B methods and found C. The limitations are D. And I actually take notes like that. What's the advantage of taking notes like that, do you think? There's a few, but what do you think?
Gives you the bottom line up front.
Gives you the bottom line up front?
The takeaway.
Okay, right. It creates something usable right then and there instead of having to come back to it. But what else?
Also how you'll write it in paper. I mean, your literature, you could, author this, cited, whatever you use.
Ah, yeah, yeah.
You put this on a 3x5 card, you arrange those in your sequence you want, and then there's your outline.
Oh, we actually have some 3x5 card examples on here. You're psychic, my friend. But, so give me an example of, yeah, go ahead.
So it also makes sure that you don't leave out one of those parts if you get
Yes.
into the habit.
Yes.
Forget about the limitations, so you know that part of your note that won't do that.
Yes, exactly, because one of the worst situations that you can be in is to have to read an article, scribble down some things in the margin. This is okay if you actually do it this way, but I think, you know, we can maximize our time. To scribble down something in the margins, come back to it and say, well, wait, what exactly was that one point? I can't quite remember that. It's better to create something usable right away that you can then shape later, because ultimately, as you saw in your sample literature reviews, there was still a fair amount of author by author by author. You can't escape that in a literature review. The thing that's different is that it's shaped in a very particular way. So someone give me an example of just how easy it is using any study that you've read and summarize this single study using that format. And you don't have to be limited to just 4 sentences, of course, but anyone, amuse me. Yes, please.
O'Toole and Meyer, 2009, I think, studied the Proverbs of Administration and found little empirical support for the sayings.
Okay, how'd they study them?
I don't.
Okay.
They looked at empirical, I think they looked at other studies, looked at
Okay.
looked for empirical.
Did they do like their own literature review or a meta-analysis or something?
What was it, meta-analysis?
Meta-analysis? Okay, all right, fantastic. Someone else? Yeah, please.
Validity in 1997 studied the effect of adverse childhood experiences on chronic disease and social outcomes using data gathered from Kaiser Permanente health system and found there's a direct correlation between adverse childhood experiences and poor health outcomes. The limitations were other social determinants that weren't included in the study.
Okay. Yeah, I love it. I love it. Now, there's just a few other things you could probably fill in there, like you'd mentioned the correlation, so I'm thinking there's probably a range of statistical tests that were conducted there, so you could say, oh, they used X statistical test there, and then here's some other things that they didn't consider right there. Exactly. So, and I can just use one of my own. You know, McCandless, 2017, studied the experiences of LGBT homeless youth with police using an exploratory phenomenological collective case study design with interviews with 18 individuals, police, nonprofit workers, and homeless LGBT youth. I had to think about that for a second. And then there's actually quite a lot of findings right there. And of course, there are a few limitations right there. The advantage of doing something like this is it creates something usable right away, and it forces us to think and forces us to account for things in a very particular way. The topic, the exact methods, the findings, and of course the limitations. So it's essentially almost like a mini literature review by itself, if the literature consisted of one study. You can kind of probably see where I'm going with this from here. And of course, there are other types. You don't have empirical articles. Very often, the things that we would read in public administration, yes, they're empirical articles, but a lot of them are reflection pieces too. Theory pieces, let's step back and think sort of pieces, so forth. And you know, those very often can be the ones we get the really, really great information. And there's a little format for that too. author year examined A and had X arguments, or author examined A and concluded B, both of which end with what these indicate in total is B, where A is the topic, X is the total number of arguments, for ordinal words to guide all this along. First they argued this, second they argued this, and B, what the overall point is. An advantage of this, again, you're creating usable material, but you're distilling down the essence of what they're saying into just a few sentences. And of course, why do we care about B? What they indicate in total is B. You already know the answer to that. Yeah, exactly. And so what I'm going to show you is that I'm going to show you that it actually does work. So this is from my, not qualifying exam, what's it called? Comprehensive exam, what we call it there. And of course, this was not the final literature review, because if this was, I would have failed, and probably rightfully so. But we had a question that was on the policy process and involved social capital. And so how many of you have done qualifying exams so far? Okay. Oh, so okay. We see, the thing is, you're still in therapy. No, I know. You know, it's so funny. I had so much coffee when I was doing that. I couldn't drink coffee for about 2 months afterwards. I just got sick of the taste. I just couldn't do it. But, you know, it was worth it, kids. You know, it was a good experience, ultimately. And so what I did here is that I knew that this was going to be valuable to me. And so these are the notes, actually, that I took on the day, and I intentionally saved them. As you notice, it's actually pretty rough. I'm actually not doing some of the things that I told you, because I got a little lazy at times. I mean, started writing at 5 o'clock in the morning, but, you know, what do you do? And I just have authors, what they said. I have a couple citations right there, and I just do this again and again and again for various studies. And sometimes I could just get a sentence out of them. These authors just said this, and I can get nothing else from this article. But imagine in which I would have, you know, 6, 7, 8 pages of just nothing but this. I'm just taking notes in a particular way. Author, year, found, so forth. What we're going to be doing here, we're talking through this process of how you can take something like this, because you know how to take these notes in a very particular way. Author studied A using B methods, found C, limitations are D, turning that, a collection of these, into a single section for a literature review, and then how you combine these sections into an entire literature review. So any questions so far? Not at all? Wonderfully straightforward? All right, good, fantastic. I hope that's what it is. And so after you get your basic notes completed, what you're going to be doing, of course, is grouping them by studies, by topics and subtopics, for which you'll form the themes. And this begins to form the backbone of meals. So tables are useful, cards, as you'd mentioned earlier, are useful, and so there's a few ways of actually doing this. So this is what I did. And again, this is the actual screenshot of Microsoft Word. That's not a great main point. It's the beginning of something, but it's not all that great. But what I did is I took all of those studies, and what I did is I just said, well, okay, there seem to be some basic definitions of social capital. There's various types, there's measurement suggestions, and then there's some analysis, and also this little bit at the end that says, need to find. This is where my deductive reasoning came in by saying, it seems to say this overall, but I can't seem to account for these things here. And so all that I did was that I just moved these elements into these basic categories right there, which has the advantage of what? It actually has a few advantages, but can you name a few advantages of doing it, something like this?
Well, it organizes the material into types, which then you could use that as a structure potentially for your literature reviews as some sort of subcategory, different sets of subcategories, and then it identifies the gap.
Okay, yeah. And the thing is that it could also be a fake gap too. Because I could say, well, actually, there are studies there, but at least I'm beginning to narrow in on what that gap might actually be, and so forth. But also what's the advantage of this is that I can actually do this one at a time. And it makes it easier cognitively to handle this amount of information by saying, I really don't have one big essay to write at first. I actually have 4 smaller ones that I can organize one at a time and then bring together into a coordinated whole. And what's great about this is because you've taken notes in the way earlier, you've already created usable material. You've already created something that's typed, it's written out, and that you can just begin to shape in that way. That's one of the purposes of taking notes in that particular way, is to make as much usable material up front, so that way you don't have to do it at the back end. Yes, sir?
So it looks like there's a couple of examples where the same study or article
Yeah.
may fit multiple categories.
Exactly right.
That's okay.
Absolutely right.
Do you have a separate note statement for each? Do you have one statement for that study, or do you have a separate one for how it fits in the type and another one for how it fits in the measurement?
You know, that's a great question, because you can extend it. I think you kind of see where I'm going right here, is that you could, if you're looking at something like definitions, you can easily create the notes right here. Because you're right, because you wouldn't want to have something where it's just an absolute repeat. It would just, making it distinguish, right? So that's exactly right. So you could do something like that, of course. Or you can do what's called the Kirschner method, which is actually there's actually a name for it, is actually you'd put them on note cards and physically manipulate them and so forth, which works for tactile learners. So all you've done at this point is take notes in a very particular way over numerous successive studies. All you've said is say, okay, this first article is blue, this first article is blue, this first article is blue, this other article is yellow, and so forth. It's just taking them as almost individual snapshots, but then you're just putting them together into categories that are labeled. And then you refine each one, which we're going to be going through right now, to find the theme for each category, which you notice I did have identified. Let me just go back a little bit, sorry. Which you notice I did have identified right up there, because that sentence was probably the most important thing up there, at least what I found at that time about the lack of scholarly consensus on defining and measuring, but I can go up with a few examples. So let's talk a little bit about how you get to that main point, which we've been sort of building up toward. So we have to use induction in order to find what that main point is, and there's a couple different ways in which you can do it. And the easiest way is just to say what we've been doing before. What findings seem to occur the most, and the variations in those findings. Nice and easy, easy peasy. Another way of doing it, what scholars mostly agree upon. Scholars seem to agree upon this, but there's some disagreement on that. That's perfectly fine. Another one is also the state and quality of the literature. Our Latino youth sample, first two sentences of status of Latino youth, that was a state and quality of the literature type main point, where it just says most studies are on this, or few studies are on this, but most of them that focus on this other element right there. You could also have scholars have studied the phenomenon under investigation. That's a perfectly acceptable main point. What do you think I mean by that? Yeah, exactly. It's exactly about methods. You can, if you need to make an argument in your literature review that something needs to be studied in a different way, a main point can absolutely focus on that. And so, for instance, in the social equity literature, you can actually find both. You would say most investigations of this have been quantitative, but we need interviews. Others will say most have been qualitative, so we need large N studies, so forth. These are just basic ways of doing that. Or simply the aspects of what's been studied. Scholars have studied X by looking at A and B, which you just say, well, here's what A is, here's a bunch of studies, here's what B is, here's a bunch of studies, and so forth. Or some combination of two or more of these. And then what's also really important, too, in the literature review is that the main points need to be very obvious. It needs to sound like a literature review as well. And, of course, that comes down to the language we have. So the main point, or the theme for that category of the literature, what it says overall in the state and quality. And so remember, it's what in total the literature suggests about the topic. And these are the most commonly occurring ways in which they occur. The literature suggests, studies indicate, scholars have argued, and so forth and so on. And this is one of the deep, dark secrets of writing literature reviews. And I think some of this might already be intuitive for you. It's just that this structure has to be there in order for the logic of the argument to essentially come through, so you can get to the point by saying, therefore, this proposition or this hypothesis is advanced. But it has to be written in a very particular way, notes taken in a very particular way, everything presented in a very particular way. And so the overarching requirement of E, because you know how the M is created, is just to present the studies logically. How do our authors do it in our Latino youth sample for that first major paragraph under status, that big long paragraph? How basically do they do it? How basically do they organize it?
They describe three categories.
Okay, yeah. How is that paragraph itself organized? It's actually very intentional in the way they organized it. It's actually big to small to big. It's a very logical way of presenting the information. What I mean by big to small to big. They start off with the big, large end studies first. I think the first couple ones, this is on the actual, the full section itself, yeah. I think the first couple ones, they talked about large probability sample. I think one of them, they had one where several thousand individuals participated. And it goes all the way down to specific populations. It goes down to Latina girls, Latino boys, and then it spreads out broadly again. What's the advantage of organizing something in that way? And it's a very intentional way of organizing. They are planning this, these authors. What's the advantage, do you think, of organizing it in that way?
Especially, maybe they're trying to focus attention, so drilling down to whatever their key interest.
Mm-hmm. Okay, yeah. What else?
Trying, the large studies are going to orient you to the problem as a whole, then they're going to give you specific examples of
Yes.
this is different than this, or this is the same as that.
Yes.
And then they kind of try and pull it all together with another large description.
Exactly right. It flows cognitively very, very well. And it's the big picture again, down into these narrow specifics, and then broadens it out again. Because these authors will know that we're going to be paying attention to this very particular type of structure. So what this ultimately means is that it's not just author by author by author. It's actually presenting them in a way that is, of course, going to be giving this logical picture of the study itself. And so there's a couple ways of doing this. You could write the M in such a way that it overtly establishes the order of topics. That's probably the easiest way of doing it. I do that way all the time. Scholars have noted that A, B, and C seem to indicate X. I know, I love this A, B, and C, and X. I could be saying almost anything right there, couldn't I? I really could be. And what I'm doing right here is I'm just saying is that there's these three sub-aspects of the literature. Let's just say it's about volunteerism and nonprofits or something. And they say, well, this characteristic and this characteristic and this characteristic seem to indicate this about why people volunteer. What's the advantage of writing something like that? Well, again, big lesson, very nice and obvious, gives the high-level picture, and you know exactly what probably should come after this, which is what? Here's the overall topic. Okay. Here's what it says about A. Here's a bunch of studies. Here's what it says about B. A bunch of studies. C. Here's a bunch of studies all the way about X. Really making this in very tedious detail right here, because this is one of the wonderful ways when people say, okay, I get that now, because Sean only said it too many times. He's really boring me about that. But you could also say, write one sentence after the M that overtly establishes the order of topics. So you can even say X topics are important for this discussion, A, B, and C. The overall literature says this. There's three topics that are important for this issue, A, B, and C, and then you just list them right there. It establishes a cognitive structure, because when we're reading, especially academic writing, we like to have that cognitive structure of knowing what the main point is and what we're going to be talking about in the order in which it's talked about. And of course, using subsection headers apropos, subsection headers are a friend, and also some combination of these methods. And then before we get to our other examples in Mad Libs, remember that the analysis has to be there. A lot of literature reviews are going to be the main point, bunch of studies, sub-main point studies, sub-main point studies, but it has to have that analytical encapsulation right there, because this is ultimately where your argument about whether something can be studied or how it should be studied can come through. So you don't have to do it this way. It's usually better to have some analysis woven throughout, but have an analytical capstone sort of at the end of sections. But it basically consists, as you saw in these examples, in both of these examples, of just reestablishing the overall theme and identifying essentially the state and quality of the literature. So you begin by saying what's missing and the implications of what's missing. How do their authors do this in the Latino Youth Sample? In that last paragraph that begins with taken together. How do they do it? Yeah.
They point out that the context of the struggle is missing. The studies don't take into account certain aspects such as the immigration experience of the child, et cetera. And list several other things that are not taken into account. And then what the implication of that is. So without that context, practitioners and policymakers are poorly informed about what to really have.
Sure, right. But it begins with that first sentence of here's the main point. And at the end of that, you could easily have propositions and hypotheses and so forth. So usually, why something is missing is really important to identify. It's not only that something is missing, it's why something is missing, which could be, you know, it hasn't been studied with the right methods, or other methods need to be considered, or something is missing in here. They don't take into account this factor, or this other factor, or so forth. And this, of course, where your propositions or hypotheses, your relations to be tested later, will eventually emerge. And so, just to remind, this is the distinction I like to use. You might hear it a little differently, but this is at least how I was taught, is that propositions, of course, are ideal for qualitative research, hypotheses for quantitative research. And there's a whole logic about why those terms are used and so forth, but just keep in mind that's how I'm using them. And so at the end of a section or subsection, you can do something like, thus it is reasonable to assume that P1, when A precedes B, C will precede D. Or hypothesis, when A goes up, B goes down. You can posit that relationship right there. And do all of you have a copy of the Wang and Berman literature review? If you could just, maybe I can also put it on here too. Here we go. Okay. So this one's nice and short. What I'd like you to do is read just from framework right here to hypothesis 1. And try to read it in about 30 seconds or less, too, because we want to see if they get the main points right. Anyone who's reading up here still here? Cool. Okay. Just read quickly. Perfect. Okay. See, one of the reasons I like using this article is because they essentially get to the point in 2 paragraphs, which is wonderful. So you're going to notice that throughout, especially that first paragraph, notice how obviously written the main points were. They weren't making you guess. They used the ordinal words, the first and second. Everything is nicely organized. It establishes that cognitive framework for you. So Wang and Berman were using essentially the meal system. Maybe they weren't using it by name, but they were essentially doing that until eventually what they get right here is ultimately down to hypothesis 1. And then what they get to is that they've all been establishing about these theories and the differences they have in these theories. It says, according to these theories, the role of elected officials in performance measurement varies between marginal and indifferent. And so they say these are the perspectives, and in order to examine these divergent perspectives, the study will study the following hypothesis. and then they advance it right there. They tell the story in order to get to what the hypothesis is, but ultimately it comes down to the meal. So let me ask you this, did you notice meal in these paragraphs? No?
Focusing on content, not necessarily.
Okay. That's good, that's good. But now that you have that framework, can you see? Absolutely, wonderful, I love it, I love it. So, with that in mind, we have that right there. We just talk about the L, and then we're going to talk about some Mad Libs. So this is the last part of meal. So we have main point, evidence, analysis, linking, wraps it up. So the L, because you could also say, you were saying meat earlier, you could just say transition. Meat, it would work just as well. Linking consists, of course, just transitioning the next section, and of course, relating a category of literature back to the whole. And this is what a literature review is again and again and again. It's introduction, meal, 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 and so forth. That's one of the deep, dark secrets of writing literature reviews. And so what I'm going to show you is going back to my example of all the way from taking notes on Putnam and Uphoff and Grutiert and Van Basteyler, and how you can put them together into the basics of a literature review. And what I'm going to ask you to notice is notice the main points, citations and analysis, and this is mine, so it's okay to make fun of it as much as you want. It's a little rough. I mean, I've only been working on it for about 2 hours, but I wanted to show you that it does work. So this is it. Back from when I took the qualifying exam. This is about 2 hours worth of work. I don't know if that's good or that's bad, but whatever, about 2 hours worth of work. What I'd like you to do is just read through it, just basically about the main point, and get a basic sense of it. Ignoring all the grammar errors. Just a few more seconds. If you're running out of time, just focus on the topic sentences. Okay. How's it read? You don't have to spare my feelings. You really don't. Okay. Okay, so here. There you go. Yes, it's wonderful. Exactly. And it is largely organized around this main point, and I have a little bit of analysis down there. Now, here's what I want to tell you about this. All I have done at this point is I have just taken a bunch of notes. I have put them into tables, and I said, okay, these seem to be here, these seem to be here, these seem to be here. And the first draft of this was just attaching a few topic sentences that seemed to unite these things together and having this little capstone at the end. All I have done was copy and paste and copy and paste and write a sentence at the beginning and a little bit at the end. And boom, I have essentially a reasonable first draft. I think it went through about 19 after this. It was kind of a long day. But, a reasonable first draft of the literature review. And yes, there does need to be some shaping there, which I did. Some of the main points do need to be a bit stronger. That second paragraph, for instance, that could definitely use a stronger main point. But I'm eventually getting to this point where I'm beginning to identify some sort of gap right there that actually you can do. And so this is essentially what I mean by taking notes in a particular way, grouping things into categories and subcategories, finding the theme, shaping it using meal, main point, evidence, analysis, and linking, ending with that analytical capstone where you can begin to forward the propositions or hypotheses. Boom, you're done. One down, 3 to go if that happens to be it, and then you begin to shape them one at a time. This is one of the things why I love teaching the nuts and bolts of writing, because when we break these things down, we could see, oh yeah, you know, really solid writing that keeps us interested, especially academically interested, will have a very nice structure, and very often a repeating structure that will, maybe they may not call it meal, but it essentially will be meal. And this is one of the things I like about literature reviews, because ultimately it then comes down to reading a lot, grouping things, using induction to find out what the main points are, moving on to the next topic. A lot of it, actually, in writing a literature review and doing it successfully, is structural. But of course, by structural, it's also functional. In fact, it's forcing you to think in a very particular way. I need to know the main point in this, because imagine just coming in through the doors here, and say Dr. Williams, because he just happens to be right here, and he asks you, what does the literature say overall? And you only have the time from when you get to the door to here. You have to be very quick about that. And I know I've been in situations where professors have asked me, what's the point? And, you know, I would have probably walked right into Lake Springfield with the amount of time that I would have needed to sort my thoughts out. But that's one of the things that we're ultimately trying to go for. So let's just go over some Mad Libs in a little bit right here. And you can use these elements to guide constructing your own literature reviews. So this is what I was telling you about Mad Libs. This is more of the deep, dark secrets of literature reviews, because they're all basically written in the same way. And what I do is that I just put brackets in there, because, and obviously you can be more creative when you're writing like this, although sometimes in my published work I'm really not more creative than this, but that's okay. Begin with a brief link between the client issue and the existing literature, and of course I call that the client issue. That is the thing that you are examining, the overall issue that you're examining. You're reminding readers of just what it is. Several topics implicate this issue. First, identify first category. Second, identify second category. Third, and so forth. You're just being nice and overt about what you're talking about there. And that's all that an introduction is. Context, and of course these different categories, and you know some other elements coming up. Because in your literature review body after that, at a minimum, you just have to establish this. You still have to have the themes later, but that's essentially what the literature introduction is. It's just identifying what the categories are. Then you're using meal for each section. Main point, what the literature says overall about a category, the themes, and each paragraph needs to have its own clearly stated theme as well. Evidence, what specific studies say, the analysis, what's missing, linking smooth transitions, and of course for each section, introduce the state and quality of literature, indicate what the literature says overall, and narrate sub-themes. I apologize if this is going to be in your dreams tonight. Am I consistently saying this and so forth? But you know, I know it helped me when I learned some of these things. And so here's a literature review introduction to a section. You have your overall introduction, but all the introductions to sections are essentially written the same way. Overall, the literature on first subtopic is give state of the literature, developed, underdeveloped, and so forth. Indicate what scholars have said generally, and then overtly identify the subtopics, including blank. So I'm going to put someone on the spot here. With your topic, whatever it happens to be, fit it into this format, just on the spot. Someone volunteer. Or I might have to call on someone. I know there's some dissertation writing going on out here, so don't be shy. Okay, Bob?
I'm not quite at that stage yet.
Do you want to give it a try, though? Want to give it a try with the topic you're interested in?
Well, I can tell you the literature topic is organizational citizenship.
All right, let's do it.
And it's been developed over the last 30 years or so.
Okay.
Increasingly so. And there's been some contradiction in terms of measurements, different scales that are used to measure this concept. Scholars have indicated that overall there's something there, that people do things, particularly at work, because they want to do them, they're not compensated for them, they're not expected to do them, and others don't.
Good.
Several subtopics include what leads people to do these actions where they're not compensated.
Good.
There's different theories
Love
that
it.
suggest there's different reasons people do it, and those would be the subtopics.
Good, fantastic. pretty good. Pretty darn good for putting you on the spot, and thanks for playing along, too. Anyone else want to give it a shot? And if you're too shy to do it right now, or you just want to digest this and so forth, just keep in mind that, again, overall the literature is this. Begin with that big high-level picture, give some basic ideas of what they have said, several subtopics are evident, and then where you go from there is each paragraph is actually written in a very particular way. This is sort of fun. Read almost every literature review in the world, especially in the academic literature in the United States. They essentially follow this format again and again and again. There's a lot of wonderful repetitiveness and also some redundancy within the academic literature, because that's also to make sure that people get the point, too. So for instance, some scholars have found, state what scholars have found on a particular subtopic. Author said this, findings indicate that, author said that, then transition to the next subtopic. So you see in literature reviews, you are going to be having author by author by author to a degree. To a degree, that's just not avoidable. But it's put into this framework of meaning, and this is what the framework always, always is. And then conclusions. Now keep in mind that you would be having, if you had these individual sections, you'd be having hypotheses at the end of these sections. Usually literature review conclusions, what they're going to have is that the literature presents, here's the number of major themes. This is your opportunity to say, here's what the literature says overall. So you notice in the Latino youth article, they put this at the beginning. They put that in the second paragraph of the introduction. That's fine. You could also put it at the end, too. You could actually put them in both spots, too, if you have a committee that wants it that way. This is also up to your discretion, up to the committee. Especially long literature review, it might be helpful to put them in both spots. In literature review for my dissertation, I had to do that. And all you're saying is just, here's just what it says overall. This is essentially just your version of the second paragraph of the Latino youth article. And then you can remind readers of the hypotheses. X hypotheses and propositions were advanced. They are as follows. List them. Boom, you go on to the methods chapter, if you're writing in that way, that is. So, before we go into a little bit of APA, do you have any questions, comments, concerns, prognostication, whatever it happens to be, about this process? Well, this has just explained everything about, what questions do you have still remaining about conducting literature reviews?
There are two issues. One is writing literature reviews, and the other is researching literature reviews, or doing the inductive work. Mm-hmm. So the Latino article you read,
yeah.
There are, I just took a glance, maybe 75 papers.
Yeah.
There are probably 7,500 papers written on a topic.
Right.
Social work, psychology,
right.
Public policy, anthropology, all kinds of different directions.
Yeah.
I think it's difficult to know how much is enough, whether you have expertise, because you don't want, the one bad thing is you finish, you publish or whatever, and oh, you missed this seminal piece.
Yeah. And it's going to happen, too. Even in the peer review process, it's going to happen. In fact, a lot of the times in the peer review process, they say, hey, you didn't cite so-and-so. And it might actually be the person who wrote the article saying the review, too. Because I know, because I've done it. That's a really good question. And usually what the standard recommendation is that for the first round of trying to find out what's important, you pretend that nothing exists 5 years before the date that you're writing. Now, that's just for the first bit. Now, you don't necessarily always have to do that. But if you focus particularly on the most recent 5 years, that allows you to identify what studies seem to be the classic ones, because they'll always be cited, but also what the most recent research has been. And then from there, that actually begins to establish the strains where you then go for it. Because ultimately what's going to happen is that any literature review you write, these authors, for instance, couldn't read 7,500 things. They begin to stop when they reach saturation, which is they're finding the same points again and again and again and nothing new. And then the way you know that whether something's missing is that you use that deductive reasoning, and you just guess. We're saying, wait, has anything been accounted for in terms of this? You go find it, oh, there is this one thing there. But eventually that's how you discover the gap, is you do that enough times to say, this is genuinely something that's missing because I cannot guess of anything anymore that that might be missing, and so forth. That's the process in which I do it. Yeah.
Practically speaking, what I've seen in our cohort is people start with a question they're interested in. They
Sure.
don't go do extensive research, literature search, and find out there's a gap. They start with a question that is
Absolutely.
of interest to them. That
Absolutely.
may have been answered.
Absolutely, absolutely, absolutely. And that's one of the great things about the research is because I think every person in this room can probably identify with this idea, I have a question. It may already be answered, but in the process of finding out that there is that answer, we come up with a new sub-question. Exactly. I mean, that's how I originally was going to be, I was looking at, social equity broadly. And then I said, in terms of one very particular aspect of public service, and I thought, oh, this is going to be so great. And I said, oh, wait, there's actually this whole huge literature out there that is the answer for it. And I discovered the question about social equity accountability in one book chapter by Susan Gooden about that. And I said, this is just entirely underexplored. So yeah, I mean, it absolutely is wonderful to start with that question, because then you'll get to your question later. And then it is a highly iterative process, as you know. I think that's one. Any other questions? Other concerns? Because I think, Dave, I think what your question really highlights before I get to the APA is that what people I think really struggle with is very often the process. It is, how do I take all these multiple studies and get to this point? But what this framework sort of tries to make someone do is to think in terms of always remembering those inductively derived main points, evidence analysis, and linking. And that those other questions become more like, at what point do I reach saturation, and so forth. That's ultimately what it is that taking notes in a particular way, combining them, and creating meal. Yes?
On the taking notes part.
Yeah.
Obviously, the ideal is you get down to a structured, one-sentence summary of, 70-page article, whatever it is.
Or 4 or 5.
Yeah, but as you're reading the article, are you still taking notes in the margins and stuff, and then at the end you're summarizing all that, or are you going into it with that question already in mind and you're trying to fill it in?
Okay, no, that's wonderful. I mean, I would say whatever works for you. The way I prefer to do it is I will go through and I will intentionally look for those elements right away, because that creates that structure meaning first, because I don't know about you, but I can't remember the last time in which I read an article front to back in that order. I'll always look for these particular things first and then fill in the gaps later. So I also don't like that note taking in the margins. That's more of a personal preference, but that's what I do. Great question. Any other questions? Is anyone struggling with their literature reviews, or you have a question that wasn't addressed by this presentation? So this was the definitive statement on literature reviews for all time. Okay. All right. On writing them, right, exactly. Which is, I think, probably the most difficult bit, because a lot of that front end work is getting that information. So no more questions? Okay, because you can always, if you ever want some feedback like that, you can always write to me, and of course I'll be starting here in the fall, hopefully, on some of your dissertation committees, and giving you a lot of feedback like that. But let's just wrap up just with a little bit of APA. I just always have to do this because I used to teach writing and so forth. In terms of the literature reviews, just remember, in terms of APA, these are the only 4 major ways of citing something in APA. And if it doesn't quite look like that, you might want to consider revising, because last author, last name, verb, last name, year, of course, page number at the end, or page number like this. I always have to mention that to everyone, because believe it or not, that question comes up quite a lot in terms of APA. And so, yes, they did. I know, and that's okay. And there's some in my published work too. I actually I had a citation mistake too, and I saw it. I was like, oh, God. but I might be the only one to notice. And so, larger suggestions. Follow a logical order. Make sure everything is clear to someone who's not as familiar with the issue as you are. That's why you write in terms of meal. Write succinctly, professionally. Each theme should be connected across sections. That's why you're going for meal. And of course, edit, edit, edit. So with that, that is the basics of writing the literature review, the mechanics of it. And so now you just need to know, take notes a particular way, organize them, go for meal, do it again and again and again for all the sections and with your list of propositions, and make sure that snapshot to explain to someone in 30 seconds how that's there. And you already know how to create that too, because I gave you a list of suggestions about commonly occurring findings and so forth, and those are the deep, dark secrets of literature review. So thank you.